What is happening, everyone? Welcome back to episode 19 of Manny's Food Channel. It's your boy Manny, aka Mr. Cooking It Up. And for this episode, I've been craving something sweet, and at the same time I'm also really lazy, so I wanted to make something that was very quick and easy and very rustic as well. So I decided to make a pineapple cake with a lemon-infused mascarpone whipped cream. Now, as fancy as that sounds, it's actually very easy to make. There's very little components to it, and the cake on its own is actually very delicious, so if you don't want the cream, you can definitely omit that step. But all it is just pineapple cake with the mascarpone whipped cream, topped with a bit of a coral garnish as well as some fresh fruit. So without further ado, let's get down to business. So to start off this pineapple cake batter, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mix in 2 eggs along with the can of crushed pineapple. Now the great thing about this recipe is that it doesn't require a great amount of technique, and it's very simple to put together, and the prep time shouldn't take you more than 20 minutes to half an hour. But the first thing I'm going to do is mix both of these ingredients together. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all the dry ingredients together first before I mix it into the wet ingredients. So I'm just going to add some baking powder, a touch of baking soda, a little bit of salt, and some sugar to my flour. And I'm just going to mix this in very well before I add it to the wet ingredients. Now that our ingredients are mixed, I'm going to slowly add in the dry ingredients to the wet ingredients, so that way we can remove any of the lumps that are in the batter. And I'm just going to add them in batches, making sure that every time I add some of the dry ingredients, all the ingredients are well incorporated before I move on to the next step. You don't have to sieve or put the dry ingredients through a strainer. We can just add them in, because ultimately when we mix it in, we're going to be removing any of the lumps anyways. Typically for this recipe, I don't like to add any fat to it, but this time around I'm going to add a touch of butter just to give it a bit of a richer flavor and texture in there. So if you want, you can add this when you're mixing the wet ingredients, or you can add in the end, doesn't matter. But I'm just going to add about a 1/4 cup of melted butter, and then just fold that in there. And then we're going to butter some baking pans, baking sheets, or whatever kind of molds that you would like to add them in, and then we'll just toss this in the oven. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to pop this in the oven at 330 degrees Fahrenheit for about half an hour or so, or until the top starts to get golden brown. But in the meantime, we're going to move on to the glaze for the cake. So for the glaze, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to melt some butter, and then we're going to add in the sugar. The pot is only hot enough just to melt all the ingredients. I don't want to boil it or bring it up to a simmer or anything like that, but just enough to melt all the ingredients. Now, another reason why I never add butter to the batter itself is because the glaze itself is very rich, but this time I decided to make an exception. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to wait until the sugar and the butter melts before we add in the heavy cream and the vanilla extract. So now the butter and the sugar is well incorporated. You can see it's become really smooth and really light texture. I turned off the stove because I don't need to cook this anymore. And now I'm just going to add a touch of vanilla extract. Depending on how much vanilla flavor you want in there, I would add about a teaspoon-ish. And then I'm going to let this cool off for another 2 to 3 minutes, and then I'll add in the cream.
discussed with you.
Now the top, as you can see, is very golden brown, but the way to test whether or not the cake is ready is just grab a piece of stick and see if it comes out clear, which it is now. And if it is, then you're ready to put on the glaze. Now because the glaze is very rich and it adds a nice, very nice like rich flavor into the cake, I like to just poke a couple holes in the cake so that way the glaze seeps into the cake. So just grab a fork. You don't have to go all the way through, just pierce the top of the cake. And then we're going to put on the glaze. And make sure you evenly distribute all the glaze in the cake.
With this feeling I can leave. I'm working and I'm dreaming. Will you dare to give it all?
And now we're just going to pop this back into the oven for around another 5 to 10 minutes until the glaze seeps into the cake. And we'll move on to make the mascarpone whipped cream. So now the glaze has seeped through the cake and it's cooked off for another 5 minutes or so in the oven. Now I'm just going to let this rest at room temperature until it completely cools down. And then we will throw this in the fridge. But while we wait for the cake to cool down, now we can start on our mascarpone whipped cream. So when you're making this mascarpone whipped cream, you can definitely use a mixer. But what I did here is I just put a towel at the bottom, a little bit of ice, using 2 metal bowls. And this bowl here, as well as the whisk, I left it in the freezer for at least like 10 to 15 minutes, so that way it could be extra cold. So the whipped cream will whip a lot faster. But if you don't want to do it by hand, you can certainly use a mixer. The only reason why I'm using my hands is because I'm not making a big batch of it. So first you have to whip up the whipped cream until it has a nice fluffy peak. So I've been whipping this cream for about 5 minutes now, and as you can see, it's got a nice peak to it. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add powdered sugar, and then I'm going to slowly fold that in.
In heart, counting trees around.
Next, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a touch of vanilla extract. Now, the reason why I added powdered sugar instead of granulated sugar is because I want to remove that texture that sometimes doesn't mix well with whipped cream. If you add granulated sugar, it might not be well infused and well incorporated into the whipped cream. So now I'm going to whip this up and mix this very well. And I'm going to fold in mascarpone cream.
Do you see the road? Just get me.
Finally, I'm going to zest 1 lemon into the mascarpone whipped cream, and then we're going to put it in a piping bag and leave it in the fridge to set. And while we do that, we are going to move on to making our coral decoration. So to make this coral TUILE garnish, it's very simple. It's only 3 ingredients. So first I'm going to add water and flour together and give that a quick mix. Make sure everything is well incorporated. And then next up, you can just add in the food coloring of choice, just a couple drops, and then mix that in. And then we can move on to frying off these garnishes. So there's a couple things that you need to make sure before you start frying off your coral TUILE garnish. First is make sure that your pan is extremely hot. Second is you're going to use canola oil because canola oil doesn't burn. And third, make sure your mixture is mixed very well before you add it into your pan. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a couple tablespoons of canola oil and make sure that's heated up extremely well. And make sure you be careful because once we put the mixture inside this pan, it's going to splash back a lot and the oil will splash out. So just make sure you be careful because the oil will be really hot. So we're going to wait till this gets hot. And then now we're going to make sure that the mix is mixed in very well. And then we're going to throw it into our pan.
This is our day to dream.
Now you can see that it's stopped to bubble out. So just use a spatula if you have one, or a fish spatula could work too. And then just remove the tuile, and then you should get a nice big piece like that. And then just put it on a piece of paper towel, so that way you can strain off or drain off any of the oil. And then we'll move on to the next batch.
Just get me.
Now this recipe is extremely easy. Definitely have a try. Let me know how it is. It's a very fluffy and light cake as well. And depending on how big of a sweet tooth you have, you can always adjust the sugar levels in it as well. But anyhow, cheers.
See the sun goes down, driving lights.
As always, extremely delicious. It's very light and fluffy, and that added little bit of lemon zest in there definitely lifts the cake to a different dimension. So definitely have a try. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to seeing everyone next time.